right, good evening, friends. We are about to begin. I know that we have many more colleagues and students walking to this venue after their class, and so we'll probably have some more of the audience members trickling in, but I think we'll begin. It's past 5. I'm Debjani Ganguly from the Institute of Humanities and Global Cultures, and once again it gives me very great pleasure to welcome you all and to have this opportunity of hosting Amitav Ghosh for the 3rd time in as many years. It's been a real privilege for the University of Virginia, the Institute of the Humanities and Global Cultures, and the Department of English to be able to host Amitav Ghosh in Virginia. So a novelist with an epic imagination, a historian sensibility, and a deep moral compass, Amitav Ghosh is easily one of the most outstanding storytellers of a world shaped by the forces of maritime colonialism, including the century-long opium trade. We've read his Ibis trilogy, of fossil-fueled capitalism, environmental degradation, and most importantly, large-scale displacements and migrations of our extended modern era. His epic scale, polyglossic, and ingeniously crafted novels of the world of ordinary men and women caught up in the vortex of history have enthralled readers from around the world. He has received many prizes and awards in his long and distinguished writing career, comprising of 9 novels and 4 works of nonfiction. And just in December 2018, Amitav Ghosh was awarded India's highest literary honor, the Jnanpith. It is an immense distinction, and the first time in a country of 22 languages and literary traditions, the first time that a writer in English has been honored with the Jnanpith Award. So Amitav Ghosh in Spring is a theme and a refrain we have become familiar with at UVA for those of us who have had the privilege of hearing him and conversing with him these past 3 years during his residency. Especially memorable has been our engagement with his powerful intervention in his book, The Great Derangement, on the most serious threat facing our planet, that of anthropogenic climate change. For literary scholars in particular, the book was a revelation for its sharp indictment of the occlusion of climate upheavals in mainstream novels, realist novels, from 1750 to the late 20th century. Amitav in that book puzzles over why the grid of literary forms, as he calls it, the grid of literary forms and conventions that came to shape the narrative imagination in precisely that period when the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere was rewriting the destiny of the Earth, took particular care to banish the uncanny workings of deep time and carbon-related climate upheavals. The narrative pleasure, compatible with the regularity of everyday bourgeois life of the realist novel, Amitav notes, deliberately banishes catastrophic scenarios as unmodern, and the genres that deal with it to the less hallowed category of science fiction. This evening, we are particularly fortunate to have a preview of his forthcoming novel that takes up the challenge he offered to literary novelists in The Great Derangement, that they seriously rethink their realist frames and engage with the uncanny force of the non-human and the larger planetary world in their creative work. Amitav's new novel has a rather mysterious title, as you can see at Gun Island. I can only reveal at this stage, and because the book is not out yet, I can only reveal at this stage that this island is one of the most breathtaking sites in the world today, somewhere in the Mediterranean, and also one endangered by sea level rise. Oh, and there are references to Henry James' The Aspen Papers, Shakespeare's famous merchant Antonio, and his Jewish moneylender Shylock, and Thomas Mann's renowned novella scattered in this work. The mystery of the Gun Island unfolds in an extraordinary tale of climate upheavals and mass migrations, stretching from the perturbations of the Little Ice Age in the 16th and 17th century to our contemporary crisis of climate displacement that by recent estimates from the International Organization for Migration will generate 200 million climate refugees by 2060. This evening, Amitav will read from his novel, The Gun Island, and will also share a film he made recently on one of the most climatically endangered zones in the world today, the Sunderbans, an archipelago of islands in the Bay of Bengal in eastern India. Known as Tide Country, the Sunderbans, as many of you know, are made up of islands, sandbars, mangrove forests, rivers, creeks, and channels. At no moment, Amitav Ghosh writes, can human beings have any doubt of the terrain's hostility to their presence, unquote. Countless residents are killed each year by tigers and crocodiles. Those that survive face not only periodic cyclones, but the humbling sight of ebb tides that literally give birth to a forest every day before swallowing it again. 15 years ago, Amitav's novel, The Hungry Tide, captured the fragile ecology of the estuarine deltas of the Sunderbans, and readers will remember his magnificent depiction of the relationship between a cetologist, Pia, and a rare species of dolphins in an environment where, as Amitav puts it, the flow of water and silt is such that geological processes that usually unfold in deep time appear to occur at a speed where they can be followed from week to week and month to month. Published in 2004, The Hungry Tide prefigured climate change even before the rise of the category of fiction called cli-fi in our times, climate fiction, or the global emergence of climate change in public consciousness. The precarious ecology of the Sunderbans that Amitav captures in The Hungry Tide, the agonistic tussle between the forces of environmental conservation and social justice that the novel portrays, and the palpable presence of non-human species such as the Irrawaddy dolphin and the Bengal tiger as active agents in the novel's plot and narrative, have all contributed to making The Hungry Tide an iconic text with which to think about anthropogenic global warming and its consequences for oceanic currents and tidal geographies. The Gun Island, in many ways, a sequel to The Hungry Tide, and once you read the novel, you'll know why it is a sequel. We shouldn't be giving away more than this. A sequel to The Hungry Tide traces Sundarbans and the larger Bengal's history of climate displacement within a global narrative of flows of commodities and peoples from the shores of Eastern India to North Africa and Southern Europe. The current refugee and migration problem that has led to the rise of the far-right and neo-fascist groups across the Americas, Europe, the Anglo-Pacific world, if you think of New Zealand recently, resonates through the second half of the novel. The novel's narrative frame is, however, pre-modern, as Amitav goes back to the early modern Bengali folk poetry called Mongol Kabbo, or Mangal Kavya for Hindi and Sanskrit speakers here, literally auspicious verse in honor of a popular deity. The tale within which the novel unfolds, the plot of the novel unfolds, is a 17th century one of a Bunduki Shadagar, a gun merchant, who built a shrine dedicated to the goddess Manusha Devi, the goddess of snakes in the Sundarbans, and traversed the same path that modern climate refugees from the Sundarbans and Bangladesh take to this gun island in the Mediterranean. As we continue to encounter what Amitav calls non-human constraints on our carbon-fueled life world, we need a rejuvenated imagination and new aesthetic forms that bring ever more powerfully into view our lived experience of the crisis of climate change. Few literary voices have been more compelling than Amitav's in confronting the stark truth that we are already living in the midst of this catastrophe, that it is not an event that will unfold in the future. So I now invite Amitav to say a few words, to show us his film. It's a very special treat for us. Amitav said that he's been working on it for days now, editing the film, so that you have the privilege of getting a sneak preview. And we'll read from his forthcoming novel, The Gun Island. So this will be followed by 20 minutes, the reading and the film will be followed by about 15-20 minutes of conversation between us, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. So please welcome Amitav Ghosh.
The protagonist and narrator of Gun Island is a middle-aged book dealer, rare book dealer called Deen Datta. And while on a visit to Calcutta, he hears about this a temple built in the name of a merchant, one of the legendary merchants. His name is Bundook. So he sets off to visit this temple. And on the way, he meets one of the people who accompanies him is a young man. Well, he's really 18 or 19 years old. His name is Tipu. And actually, so he has this encounter with Tipu, who accompanies him on a steamer like the one that I was on. So he had expected an abject, morose young fellow. But it was evident at a glance that Tipu was a creature of an altogether different kind. He had the probing eyes and darting movements of a hungry barracuda. He even glinted barracuda-like because of a silver ear stud and glittering highlights in his hair, which was spiky on top and flat at the sides. As for his clothes, a Nets t-shirt and baggy jeans that kept slipping down to expose his bright red boxers, they would not have looked out of place in Brooklyn. I should explain that Tipu spent a few years in America. He was taken there by Pia, who kind of adopted him. Tipu had been speaking Bangla all this while in an unenthusiastic murmur, but his voice rose as he turned to me and stuck out his hand. "Hey there," he said in English. "How you doing?" Shaking his hand, I said, "Hi, I know who you are, Pops," said Tipu, grinning. "I know all about you." I was dumbfounded. "How?" "Looked you up on the net." I don't know what annoyed me more, the insolence of his tone, or that he had decided to call me Pops as though I were a character from a comic book. But being unable to think of a suitable rejoinder, I decided that it would be best to ignore his sallies. Only after, so he goes, he's on this steamer, he goes to this, he makes his way to this temple, he falls in the mud, he gets very dirty. And the people he's with, the boatmen, they go away to look for someone who's the caretaker of this temple or shrine, who's a young boy called Rafi, the character that I mentioned in the film. So only after they had left did I get to look around properly. And then suddenly it was as though everything I had gone through to get there, the mud, the humiliation, the chilly baptism, had all been worth it. I discovered now that I was standing at the center of a rectangular courtyard with my back to the temple. The building wasn't large, no bigger than the familiar thatched huts of the Bengal countryside, and time had not been kind to it. The roof had the convex outline of an upturned boat, and it was this, I guessed, that had reminded Nilima of the temples of Bishnupur. Nor was that surprising, for everything about the structure, its burnt sienna color, the shape of the roof, and the panels of its facade, spoke of Bengal's most celebrated style of architecture, which had originated in the kingdom of Bishnupur in the 17th century. This is a style which is perfectly attuned to the place in which it was born, in the sense that it echoes the shapes and forms of the Bengal countryside. It also makes ingenious use of the region's most easily available materials, brick, for example, rather than stone. However, a shrine built of brick cannot be carved in the manner of the great stone temples of South and Central India. So the temples of Bishnupur discharge the function of storytelling by means of terracotta friezes and bas-reliefs. These are set into the walls like plaques or tablets. On the walls of this shrine, too, there were many panels covered with tracings. Some of them had the look of simple, crudely drawn hieroglyphs. As with hieroglyphs, some symbols and motifs recurred again and again in different combinations. Among them was a symbol I had never seen before. I could not imagine what it meant. The strangest symbol of all was a recurrent image of two concentric circles. What could this possibly mean? And as if this were not baffling enough, in one of the panels, the circles were overlaid with crisscrossing lines. I stared hard at each panel, trying to imprint them on my mind. Never had I so greatly regretted the absence of my phone. I decided that as soon as the steamer returned, I would fetch my phone and camera. So caught up was I in thinking about the shrine's exterior that it was almost as an afterthought that I wandered through the arched gateway that led to its interior. It was very dark inside and seemed even more so because of the contrast with the bright mid-morning sunlight outside. But as soon as I had stepped past the gateway, I knew from the echoing of my bare feet that I was in a cavernous, domed hallway of a kind that is characteristic of this style of architecture. But exactly how tall or wide the space was, I couldn't tell, for I was aware only of a slippery mossiness beneath my feet and a chilly, slightly fetid dampness around me. As I was looking around, I became aware of a low, growling sound somewhere behind me. I spun around thinking that a dog had followed me inside. But no, framed in the arched gateway was the face of a shaggy-haired boy who was staring at me in what seemed to be utter disbelief. Who could this be but the much-awaited Ruffy? I was so delighted to see him that I hurried eagerly towards the entrance, crying out loudly, "Eitto, here you are, I've been waiting for you." But this didn't stop the boy's retreat. He continued to back away from me until his withdrawal was halted by the rim of the well. There at last he came to a standstill. Dropping his eyes, he began to breathe heavily, as if in relief at a narrow escape. He looked to be in his late teens, with a lightly feathered upper lip and long, supple limbs. His face was narrow, with large, long-lashed eyes, and a full, deep brown mouth that was downturned at both ends. "I seem to have caught you by surprise," I said. "You're Ruffy, aren't you?" He nodded and straightened himself. "And who are you?" he asked. I noticed that his accent was marked with the rustic lilt of the Sunderbans. "What are you doing here all by yourself?" "I'm Dinanath Dotto," I said. "I just came to look at the temple, and I'd like to ask you a few questions about it." His wary eyes widened. "I don't know that I can tell you anything," he said brusquely. "I never had much to do with this shrine." It was clear from his tone that he had had enough. Turning his back on the shrine, he made a gesture of dismissal. "It's all nonsense," he said, tossing his hair as though it were a mane. "There is no gun merchant or gun island. It's just a fairy tale." This was said with great vehemence, yet there was an undertone in his voice that led me to wonder whether his skepticism about the legend had something to do with a long-ago crisis of disappointment, maybe of the kind that besets children when they learn that there is no Santa Claus and no toy factory at the North Pole. "You're right," I said, humoring him. "And it's obvious, isn't it, that this dham has nothing to do with Manusha Devi?" His long-lashed eyes glinted as if in puzzlement. "Why?" he said. "Why do you say that?" "Because," I said, "if Manusha Devi had anything to do with this place, then surely there would be a snake around here, wouldn't there? A cobra." I glanced at him again and saw, to my surprise, that his face had gone rigid. He was staring fixedly at me now, with a hand over his mouth. "What's the matter?" I said. Slowly his hand fell away from his mouth. "But there is," he said. "There is what?" "There is a cobra inside the shrine. It's been there many years." It was my turn now to stare in disbelief. "Impossible," I said. "I went inside the shrine. I didn't see anything." "It was right behind you," he said. "When you came out of the shrine, I could see it behind you. Its hood was raised and its head was above your shoulder. I've never seen it like that before. It never comes out when I'm here, and I leave it alone too. It keeps other snakes and animals away. I never go in there. You must have disturbed it when you went in." "No," I said, shaking my head. "No, it's not possible." At that moment, I was absolutely certain that he was joking or deluded. It was simply unimaginable that I had stepped into a cobra's lair. Such things just don't happen to people like myself, reclusive antiquarians who spend most of their waking hours staring at screens and old books. At this point, we were at one of the dham's far corners, where the facade joined the compound's surrounding wall. From that angle, almost nothing was visible of the building's interior, except the arched entrance and the darkness inside. My incredulity at what I had just heard was such that my feet began to move of their own accord. Before I knew it, they had brought me face to face with the entrance, so that I could confirm with my own eyes that everything was exactly as I had thought. And then suddenly, there it was, appearing out of the darkness like a whiplash, rearing up as if it had been waiting for me, the intruder, to show himself again. Staring at it now, at a distance of only a few feet, I realized that it was no ordinary cobra, but a king cobra, a hamadryad, of a size such that its upraised head was level with mine. Its tongue flickered as I looked into its shining black eyes, and I became aware of a growling sound. I would learn later that this species does not hiss, but emits this other sound instead. I stood frozen as if welded to the ground. Yet, although it was well within reach of me, I'm convinced to this day that the cobra would have not harmed anybody, if not for what came next. Unbeknownst to me, Tipu had arrived at the compound's gate moments earlier and had observed the scene as it was unfolding. Imagining that I was about to be attacked, he had snatched up a fishing net and crept stealthily into the courtyard. It was only when the net was cast at the cobra that I became aware of Tipu's presence. And it was then, too, that the creature struck with astonishing speed and power. Even as the net was descending over its hood, it flung itself at Tipu and succeeded in striking him with one fang just above the left elbow. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the cobra was gone, and the net was lying empty on the ground. Tipu was on his knees, hunched over his elbow, staring at the wound on his arm. Then he slowly crumpled to the ground and looked straight into my eyes. "What do I do now, Pops?" he said in a whisper. I was in shock and could do nothing but stare helplessly. "Why did you bring us here, Pops?" So they take Tipu to a nearby hospital, and he does survive, but he's much changed. While Dinanath Dotto, the narrator, he goes back to Brooklyn, which is where he lives. Experience had taught me that to travel between Calcutta and Brooklyn was to switch between two states of mind, each of which came with its own cache of memory. For me, this alternation had happened so reliably in the past that it was not unduly optimistic, I think, to assume that my memories of that visit to the gun merchant's shrine would recede once I had settled into my Brooklyn apartment. But this expectation was soon belied. For several weeks after my return, I found it hard to focus on my work. While sitting at my desk, I was frequently ambushed by snatches of recollection from that day. Worse still, my nights were often interrupted by dreams, from which I would awake drenched in sweat with a burning sensation stewing in my guts. "Heartburn," said my doctor. It was as if some living thing had entered my body, something ancient that had long lain dormant in the mud. I could only think of it in analogy to germs or viruses or bacteria. Yet I knew it was none of those things. It was memory itself, except that it was not my own. It was much older than me, some submerged aspect of time that had been brought suddenly to life when I entered that shrine. Something fearsome, venomous, and overwhelmingly powerful. Something that would not allow me to be rid of it. I spent hours sitting at my desk, but was unable to get anything done. I urgently needed to finish my first catalogue of the year, but hours would go by without a single word being written. To fill the silence, I would play music. And it would lull me into a stupor, and hours would slip by without my being aware of it. After 2 wasted months, I went to my doctor and got a prescription for anti-anxiety pills. But even these didn't help. I was sitting at my desk one day, staring blankly at my computer, when a pop-up window appeared on the screen. Inside the window were the words, "Does the word bhuta mean ghost? Or does it mean something else?" Unnerved by this strange manifestation, I went to the bathroom and washed my face. When I came back, the window was still there, blinking. But now I noticed a line in small print. It said, "Bunduki at bunduki.com wants to start a chat session with you." I sat down and typed, "Is that you, Tipu?" The answer appeared after a couple of seconds. "Sure, it's me. Now answer the question." "Why are you asking me this?" I wrote. "Why don't you look it up on the net?" I did, and now I'm asking you. What exactly does bhuta mean? I scratched my head for a bit and then fetched a dictionary. "Look, I'm no expert on this," I wrote. "All I can tell you is that the Bangla word bhoot or bhuta comes from a basic but very complicated Sanskrit root, bhu meaning to be or to manifest. So in that sense, bhuta simply means a being or an existing presence. There was a long pause. So are you and I bhutas then? I suppose you could say so. And what about animals, snakes, dolphins? In the sense that they exist and are beings, yes, animals are bhutas too. Then why do people mean ghost when they say bhut? Because bhuta also refers to the past in the sense of a past state of being, like when we say bhutakala or times past. Another long pause. But if the same word means both existing and existed, wouldn't it mean that the past wasn't past, that the past was present in the present? In a sense, yes. But that's impossible, isn't it? How can the past be present in the present? In the same way that you might say in English, the present is haunted by the past. I suppose that's how the word bhuta has come to mean ghost. This time his response was instantaneous. So are you saying that ghosts exist? No! I yelped. My finger had hit the keyboard so hard that I had split a fingernail. But I typed on without stopping. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just telling you what the word means. Several minutes went by before Tipu's response appeared. Okay, got it. This was followed by a thumbs up emoji, and then the window closed. I slammed shut my laptop and stared at it, shivering, half expecting it to open of itself. It was as though the most sterile object in my safe, man-made world had suddenly become a portal through which the primeval mud could draw me back into its depths. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Amitav. I must confess that I've had the privilege, Amitav was generous enough to share the manuscript of Gun Island with me. So Amitav, I'm going to just raise a few things and ask you about just so many fascinating things about that novel. And one thing, of course, that came across in your reading and that pervades the novel is the sense of the uncanny. You know, there are, in fact, the plot movement itself is composed of a series of uncanny episodes. At the same time, you know, I remember, and many of you were here, may have been here last year, when Amitav actually gave a talk on our era of great migration in the time of climate change and the staggering sense of the scale of displacement. And so, and you took us to interviews in Italy of recent migrants who had come in through the sea. And so when I was reading that, I was juggling these two images of the talk and how you take us back to the 17th century world and you bring us back in time. So could you give us a sense of, you know, say when you wrote the novel or thought of the novel, was the trigger, the research that you shared with us in terms of the climate-related displacement and migration, and were you simultaneously reading the Bengali folk tales, the Mongol Kabbo, and did they kind of all come together serendipitously? I'd love to have you know, for you to be able to share a certain sense of how these kind of uncanny archives come together, so to say. They're fascinating.
Well, you know, I think writing a novel is always in some way a slightly uncanny business, you know, because strange things happen, you know, around novels, really, really strange things. But when I wrote The Great Derangement, one of the points that I wanted to make, really, and I did make it at some length in that book, is that climate change is uncanny. It's the not at home. It's the sense of you know, we don't know, we are disoriented, we're in a world where we just don't know, you know, what's happening around us. So I think you know, to write about our world today is really to write about the uncanny, I think, and you know, so absolutely, the uncanny is absolutely, you know, at the heart of the book. So I think that is really one of the ways in which our era really challenges, the traditional methods of fiction. So I did want to get into that, but it was, as I said, a series of uncanny things that led me into this story, because I felt by the time I'd finished writing The Great Derangement that I don't want to read modern fiction. Because modern fiction is, I mean, in the sense, in terms of the reality that we face, it is so catastrophically failed. So I started reading pre-modern fiction, if you like. And fortunately, because I can read in Bangla, I'm able to read these early narratives, and in Bangla the narratives go back to the 13th, 14th centuries. In fact, the first long narrative of Manasha Devi, which is Shukubi Narayan Dev's Padma Puran, some people think it's 13th or 14th century. So these are much earlier narratives, and I started reading them, and these, even though these narratives appear in the form of praise poems, if you like, to certain gods and goddesses, they unfold exactly like novels. People speak. They're very much rooted in earthy everyday life. There are long descriptions of food, feasts, sex. I mean, it's actually kind of extraordinary how real they are, and also how much they are about the world of Bengal, in a way that I would say contemporary Bengali novels are not. Storms, disease, hunger, fear, these are all so much at the heart of these narratives, They're so much not, if you like, the realist novel. And in that sense, so powerful and interesting. So yes, I got led back into that, and it somehow just captured my imagination. And at the same time, I was traveling in Italy. In the beginning, the two didn't really have anything to do with each other. I mean, one of the curious things that people are perhaps not often aware of is that when we are told about the people who crossed the Mediterranean, we tend to think of Iraqis and Syrians and maybe Libyans and so on. But in fact, the two largest groups that entering Italy, it's not always the case, but several months in the year that's the case. The two largest groups are Bangladeshis and Nigerians. And so, I mean, it's actually an extraordinary thing. It's one of the uncanny things about the world of today, that in many Italian cities, the language that you hear most after Italian is Bengali.
Yeah.
I mean, in Palermo, there are 7 Bangladeshi mosques, and there's a Bangladeshi Hindu temple. There's also a Mauritian Hindu temple. So it's a strange thing how completely this world has changed. Because I've been traveling to Italy for a very long time, and 40 years more. You never saw Bengalis or Indians or subcontinentals in Italy, And now, it's sort of, I mean, the whole sense that of places bleeding into each other, there is something strangely sort of uncanny about it. And it was particularly interesting to me to speak to these young men, who, I mean, it's become the convention in representing the migrant that they are thought of just as victims. But they don't always see themselves as such, in their eyes, in their sort of worldview, they're heroes. They're protagonists who've launched upon incredibly dangerous journeys in the full awareness of what they're confronting.
Thank you, Amitav. What also struck me in your, drawing on these 13th, 14th century archives, and you were just saying that actually one of them that we were talking about is actually nearly 400 pages long, so the novelistic flavor. But you also invoke a particular sort of geological phenomenon that you then very ingeniously plot, you kind of link it to the Bunduki, the story of the Bunduki Shodagar, the gun merchant and his many travels. And that's the Little Ice Age. And that is one of the most fascinating moments in the novel, because of just the range, the historical strands that coalesce. It was also a period of great turbulence. It brought a lot of calamity to many parts of the world, but also was the period of the rise of the Enlightenment thinkers at the same time. You mentioned Spinoza, you mentioned Leibniz, you mentioned they were writing and beginning to craft their worldviews. So this kind of real confrontation between this turbulent, geologically turbulent age and the kind of intellectual and literary riches that were emerging, that's a really fascinating moment in the novel. Do you want to share a little about the Little Ice Age phenomenon with us?
The Little Ice Age, it started round about, the long Little Ice Age started like in the middle of the 15th century and extended into the 18th century, but the peak of it was the 17th century. And I'm obsessed with the Little Ice Age. I think it, people who think about climate change are often engaged in thinking about the future, but, my friend Giorgio Agamben always says that people who talk about to speak of the future is to project power. All that we know is really the present and the past. And I think that's all that we as humanists can do, is to draw upon the past. And really the only past that we can draw on is the 17th century, because it's, there was a 1 degree fluctuation in temperature. Temperatures fell quite. It was because of sunspots and so on, a decline in sunspot activity in the sun. So temperatures fell by basically 1 degree. And already today we have a temperature fluctuation of more than 1 degree. And we can see, and especially when you look at I just wrote an article about this actually in Foreign Policy magazine. But what the Little Ice Age tells us is that human sensitivity to climate fluctuations is much, much greater than we think. Because what happened during the Little Ice Age is almost inconceivable. I mean, about 1/3 of the world's population may have been lost. There were these terrible plagues and disease and famine and, the 30 Years' War. England went through the Civil War, the longest disturbance in its history. Europe was completely convulsed. In Russia, there were these convulsions. It was the time of the downfall of the Ming dynasty, so China was convulsed. So across the world, you had this sort of Mexico, indigenous populations. I mean, that was also, some people think that the Little Ice Age may even have been brought on by the Amerindian genocide, because a lot of trees, a lot of land reverting from agriculture to forest, therefore sequestering a huge amount of carbon. So this is one of the theories about how the Little Ice Age came about. So it was an age of absolute catastrophe on the one hand. At the same time, it was also the age in which people first discovered the power of fossil fuels. And you have all these Enlightenment thinkers coming into being. But what is really interesting, though, is that, the Enlightenment thinkers were, if you think about them, they were a very tiny group, The rest of the world saw this period as a time of apocalypse.
Apocalypse, yeah.
All the millenarian thinking, all the apocalyptic thinking across the world, the Ottoman Empire had all this idea of apocalypse, and it was actually spearheaded by a Jewish Ottoman prophet, so-called. So there was, in Russia, there was this whole cult of the old believer. They thought the Tsar was the Antichrist because he changed the Orthodox ritual, and they killed themselves, in hundreds of thousands. You had people, I mean, in England, you had the fifth monarchists who were seeing sort of miraculous visions of, all sorts of terrible beings. So, what is interesting then is that amongst ordinary people, there was a sense that something really momentous and catastrophic was launching itself, and there was a terrible, terrible apprehension. But if you think about it, the Enlightenment thinkers, they were very small, but they won out. They beat every other kind of thinking back. And they said, no, the world is perfectly organized, it's perfectly safe, this is how we go. All things are lawful, nature is lawful, and so on and so forth. And now, really, we realize that it's all turned upside down. It was the ordinary people who were right. And it was all those great old thinkers who were completely wrong. The world is not very lawful. And it can turn back and bite you.
Yeah. Or maybe Hobbes was right. He said life was nasty, brutish, and short.
Life soon will be nasty, brutish. I think certainly life soon will be exactly that. And already is that in many places.
And also, while we literary scholars tend to kind of sometimes overread parallels, and you're talking like someone who's crafted, who's an storyteller, and then how does it make you uncomfortable if someone like me says, okay, the journey that Bundook Saudagar made during this upheaval, he was kind of uprooted and then made the journey across the seas and all the turmoil that he encountered. And then there is a parallel narrative strand of Tipu and Rafi making a similar journey across a period of great continuing climate turbulence in the Sunderbans. Rather than it being one big catastrophe, rather than it's an everyday kind of, their life worlds, their land is being nibbled away by the sea, and you have these episodes. So is it too much of an overreading to see those parallel strands? I mean, the way you've crafted it, that's what struck me. When you say that rather than have a futuristic point of view, here are developments in the past that come to us distilled through these kind of early modern folk poetry. And far from being magical or far from being something fantastic, far from being, they actually contain the kernel of a realism. That realism itself has vanished from the literary realm. And it creates the genres of the magical, of the folkloric, and then, so you kind of actually are really enriching in some ways for us, the way I see it, as some other writers have done in previous decades, through magical realism or through, where you're actually rethinking the very foundations in some ways through this novel about what is the real in our times and what are the conventions of realism for the novel. So that's incredibly powerful. So turning to, your real part, another joy, another pleasures of reading is how you mine, apart from mining the archives of the past, mining language itself. Your Ibis novels created a whole dead language, vocabulary of the Lascars, the seafaring, manual laboring class of the maritime colonialism, and you actually created a whole world through their language in the novels, or the world of maritime colonialism, which is lost to us now. While here you actually go into, do you want to share with the audience without giving away too much about how you even come to this Byzantine name for this so-called gun island, which is called Bundakia? And it's that whole history that you trace of why this exquisite Italian island has that name, or you don't want to give it away?
No, I really can't. But yes, you're right. I mean, I think this book really brings together all my interests. Etymology,
languages of the
etymology,
many worlds,
language,
world,
all those things sort of come together. So in that sense, it was incredibly sort of rewarding to to be able to create a narrative where, everything that really pushes my buttons is in there.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it is really strange and also uncanny, the ways in which words conceal their histories. So all of that is so very compelling to me.
And we'll turn to the audience in just a minute, but I just want to take this kind of the last exchange that we'll have. I wanted to read a part from the book in reference to really something that has resonance here and now in the rise of the new right, the far right, the neo-fascism, a certain kind of the whole great replacement theory of the whites. And you have one of the most powerful passages towards the end of the book. I just wanted to share with the audience. This is an episode towards the end of the novel, where almost towards the end of the climax of the novel, where there are these NGOs or humanitarian workers who actually put together a rescue boat for refugees floundering in the Mediterranean waters, or who are arriving in a ramshackle boat, and surrounded by the Italian government, led sort of the armed policemen who will not let the refugees land on Italian soil. And this is, Amitav is, and as many of us know here, that there are projects here where actually even academics and activists have actually funded these rescue boats in the waters of Italy. Michael Hart and Duke is involved in one such project. So that episode really resonated with me, and this is the passage that Amitav in his novel writes when he reflects on what's happening, and he says, "I saw now why the angry young men on the boats around us were so afraid of that derelict refugee boat. That tiny vessel represented the upending of a centuries-old project that had been essential to the shaping of Europe. Beginning with the early days of chattel slavery, the European imperial powers had launched upon the greatest, the most vile, the most cruel experiment in planetary remaking that history has ever known. In the service of commerce, they had transported people between continents on an almost unimaginable scale, ultimately changing the demographic profile of the entire planet. Their entire project has now been upended. This is why those angry young men are so afraid of that little fishing boat. Through the prism of this vessel, they could glimpse the unraveling of a centuries-old project that had conferred vast privilege on them in relation to the rest of the world." And as we confront the anger of those who have ruled the world for so long, I think it's a very resonant passage, and there's. Do you want to kind of just say?
Sure, and actually that takes me back also to the question that you asked before, which I didn't really respond to, which is, does the journey of the merchant and the journey of the young men reflect each other? And is it all about climate change? Let me say, first of all, that, in these Bengali poems, the old Bengali poems, they're all about disaster. All these journeys start with these disasters, storms, famine. It's very striking, Manusha Devi is actually the goddess of catastrophe as well. So she creates waves and storms and all sorts of things. But, at the end of the day, though, still, the merchant, Chand Saudagar, sets off not only because of catastrophe, but also because he wants to make a fortune. So you can't exclude desire from this. And it's one of the very striking things about these young men, who are journeying across the Mediterranean and so on. In some sense, what has happened in our world of today is that desire has been globalized. If you think back to, say, indentured laborers or slaves, when they were transported across the seas, they knew, desire had nothing to do with it. They went there, they worked on the plantations, but they knew that whether they were working on sugar plantations or whatever, that what they were making was not meant for them. They couldn't partake of it. So the great difference now is that these young people, or these people who are moving, that is not the mindset at all. Their journeys are self-motivated. They're set in motion really by the internet and by cell phone technology. And they absolutely share the desires that you and I have, because they've seen those things on their screens. I mean, people don't realize this, but actually in places like India, in Kenya, in Bangladesh, most of all, the reach of the internet is much greater than it is in the West. Even completely illiterate people are able to access the internet through voice recognition technology. So shepherds in the middle of Bangladesh are able to see, Maseratis on the road in Italy. So, what has really happened is that there has been a sort of, if you like, this technology has let loose forces that are more powerful than anything we can imagine. And they are upending the world. And, I feel like laughing when they say, how do we put an end to migration? You can do it overnight. Just shut down the internet. It'll stop. Because, the internet is the magic carpet on which people move. It's everything that's done in this whole movement is done through the internet. You pay your trafficker through the internet, all of it. So, it's so strange. There's a clip on the net, on YouTube, of Trump railing and saying, how do these migrants have cell phones? How can they have cell phones? Where do they get cell phones? And it just goes to show how disconnected this discourse is from the reality. In Denmark, at one point they were confiscating cell phones from migrants because they thought if you're migrating, you shouldn't have a cell phone. But the reality is that it's the cell phone that is the vehicle of this migration. The people who think like that think really that those people out there, those black and brown people, they're not really human. That they don't have access to these technologies, they can't manage these technologies. They're sort of like, but this is what they don't understand, that, what is so strange about this technology is that it's skipped a huge technological gap. So that today, a poor boy in Bangladesh or in India whose circumstances have nothing to do, who lives in absolutely poor circumstances, can be expert at the internet, and expert at digital technologies. It has upended this world in a way that really we can't even begin to imagine, and it has let loose forces that we are no longer in control of. You just try and think of shutting down the internet. You can't. Nobody can. It controls you. We are not in charge. These impersonal forces have taken over.
Thank you, Amitav. Please join me in thanking Amitav.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And the floor is now open for conversation with our author. So if you have questions, if you have any points to converse with him, anything you want to bring up in relation to your previous works as well, whatever they want to bring up.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful glimpse of what sounds like another brilliant novel. I just wanted to ask you about the film. Would you mind putting your anthropologist's hat on and tell us a little bit about, your interlocutor talked about the kind of blending of Islam and Hinduism in that moment, and it really was quite striking, the prayers to Allah, but also then to obviously Hindu Day. Could you talk a little bit about that for us? It seemed really intriguing.
In a way, this whole sort of Hindu fundamentalism and Muslim fundamentalism that's become so powerful in the world, especially in the middle class world, is really so distant from the lived reality of a place like Bengal, where these two cultures interpenetrate each other in ways that are, you can't separate them really. Because, and that's why I want to show this footage so that people will understand, that how completely they misunderstand, the culture of India. And it's not just from the Hindu side, it's absolutely from the Muslim side as well, that, this kind of interweaving, this kind of, I don't even know what you can call it, this hybrid culture is under suppression from both ends, of orthodoxy, yet it lives on. It's increasingly secret, it's increasingly silent, it's increasingly sort of, how shall I say, recessed from middle class worlds and middle class lives, but it's very powerful and it's there. But if you look at, say, when people study Indian literature, vernacular literatures, they almost always focus on modern stuff, that is post-19th century and post-19th century. But in Bengali, there's a huge sort of archive of manuscripts, basically these stories like this. And the strange thing is that the Muslim stories and the Hindu stories are inseparable. They're just sort of reflections of each other. So a figure like Satyapir is also in Bengal Satyanarayan for the Hindus, and even middle class Hindus celebrate pujas of Satyanarayan. But it's there's also a Satyapir, and it's completely everywhere. You can't pry them apart. So it's baffling really that people have launched on this project of purification, if you like. A purification that can never actually be achieved. Because, the difference between Bengal and other parts of India is that in Bengal, the way that the Muslim conversions took place was that they were converting Bengalis from Buddhism to Islam. So, they had already left, as it were, Hinduism. But then in this period, one of the reasons why these Mangal Kavyas were written, why these poems were written, was to bring some of those people back into the Hindu fold. So it was two sets of reconversions often. So in Bengal, curiously, the magical is associated with Islam. To this day, it happens all the time. In my family, if someone needs, if someone wants some sort of miracle in their life or some sort of magical intervention, they won't go to a Hindu. They'll go to some Muslim peer. So that's its peculiar power. That you can't really. I'm not an expert on every part of India, so I can't say. I don't know if this happens elsewhere in India, but this is certainly the case in.
Yes.
Cyclical time or ideas of reincarnation or things like that?
Well, I don't really directly, but of course, in a sense, it is a sort of cyclical representation, yes, of time, if you like. Hi, Niti.
Thank you so much for this talk today, Amitav. I wanted to take you follow up sort of on what you were just saying about Hindu and Muslim. We hear a lot today about decolonizing syllabi, decolonizing curriculum. I was, since you've been thinking so much and reading so much about these 13th and 14th century texts, what would this mean to you? What would it mean to you in the way that we teach literature and history today? Does this phase mean anything to you?
That's a difficult question for me to answer, really. especially since I'm not really aware of the sort of the pedagogic thing. But certainly, when I see what many people put forward as the decolonized thing, it seems to me just indistinguishable from the colonial thing. I mean, none of them are talking about 14th century Mangal Kavyas or whatever, or 16th, 17th century texts written in Bengal, because these are completely different. Really, contemporary Bengali scholars don't work on these texts. There's very little work on this on these texts coming out of Bengal. People just have forgotten about them. The only scholar who really works on them intensively and has for decades is Tony Stewart at Vanderbilt, and he has a wonderful book coming out, very soon, on these texts, and I really recommend that book to everyone. I mean, it presents a civilization and a culture that, I think if these sort of Hindu fundamentalists were to read these texts, it would make them quite ill.
So, like you mentioned during the conversation, that effects of climate change, in a way that climate change causes a lot of migration, and which becomes a part of political discourse later and becomes like a topic of conversation in the political class. Do you see any causal relationship between the socio-political or the ideological shift across the world or in parts of the world due to climate change, that the relationships that we do not see, or is there a larger mechanism at work which causes a shift in ideology of parts of the world or the entire world, which is caused by climate change that people fail to recognize?
Well, the basic fact of climate change today is that very large part of the emissions that are going into the atmosphere now comes from China, India, Indonesia. Is there an ideological shift in those places? I think we absolutely cannot say that there is. In fact, if anything, there is a increased accelerationism. People want more and more and more. So no, even though countries like India are extraordinarily vulnerable. I mean, India is really looking at utter catastrophe. Not just because of climate change, but also because of man-made impacts like the draining of the aquifers. Pakistan is looking at absolute catastrophe. They're about to run out of water very, very soon, and they've become accustomed to planting these very thirsty crops like cotton and so on. I mean, the extent of the disaster that is ahead for us in Asia is hardly imaginable. I mean, the glaciers are going to go dry by 2060. I mean, essentially, a large part of the subcontinent is going to become uninhabitable. I mean, already now, as you know, there have been temperatures of 49 degrees. I mean, as far east as Bengal, 49 degrees, you can't exist outside for less than 10 minutes. I mean, that's really fit people can't exist. So, we are looking at a catastrophe, on a scale that's, and yet, if you go to India, what does everyone talk about? Growth. If you go to China, what do they talk about? Growth. In fact, if anything, today, anywhere in the world, it's impossible for any politician to not talk about growth. We forget that, it's just 40 years ago that Jimmy Carter was able to actually say, let's tighten our belts. No politician today would survive if they said that. So far from there being a change in the ideology, I think the ideology is only getting worse.
It was such a huge concept that I think I still don't understand it. But could you say a little bit more about what you said earlier, that you can't read modern novels anymore? Does that have to do with climate change or reality or forces beyond that?
Except Updike.
Well, I did feel like that. But I must say, I do think that in 2018 there was a very big change in the literary world, you know, and it was signaled by the publication of Richard Powers' Overstory, you know, which I think is a very, very important book. And you know, I detest this term climate fiction, cli-fi,
Yeah,
etc. I mean, it's just a book about our times, you know. But it's a really extraordinary novel, and I think it shows us new possibilities. But you know, last week I did an event with Annie Proulx in Washington. She just won the Library of Congress Prize for Fiction. And she wanted to do it on climate change. She wanted to do her event on climate change. So I was there. She wanted me to be there. And we had a wonderful conversation. But Annie Proulx says, and I think everybody who knows about this stuff would agree with her, that she can't think about anything else other than climate change. But she says she's never going to write any fiction about it because she can't, she feels. She's going to write essays, she's going to write something else, but she's not going to write any fiction. And it is true as well that, you know, there are many novelists who are interested in this subject, but almost always they end up writing essays. So to me, that's really an interesting question. It's a question about form, really, you know. And that's why I wrote The Great Derangement. Yes.
My question is related to something that was asked earlier. While you were talking about, in some ways, rejection of modern literature in a certain sense, I was just thinking about a couple of Bengali writers who I'm sure you are very, very familiar with, Shatikant Bhaduri and Vibhuti Bhushan. And they are located in very small spaces, but they are intensely aware of their surroundings, of the worlds, of floods, etc., etc. So it does bring in those elements very much, not on the global scale as it were, but on their own scale they are very much present as such. So to that extent, probably one can still continue to read them with a lot of profit. And I was just wondering about your reading of the issues related to climate change as such. And you rightly pointed out that in a country like in whole of South Asia, there's hardly any awareness of these issues. There's a very, very small segment which thinks about it, which talks about it, but nobody really bothers about it. But I would like you to think about what possibilities exist, because they are very, very important, very, very difficult, I know, but still you could tell us something about that.
Sure. Yeah, let me say, first of all, I completely agree with you. I think not just in Bangla, but in many Indian languages, from the period of 1930 to about 1970, if you look, or 1980, if you look at the work that came out, a lot of it was intensely engaged with the environment, with issues like that. You know, in Bengal, there are so many important writers who really wrote about, say, rivers. There's a whole tradition of the river novel in Bengal, which is very Advaita Mallabarman wrote, very powerful novel about, fisherfolk and so on. Mahashweta Devi, she wrote wonderful books. Again, very much engaged. In Oriya, there's Gopinath Mohanty and so on, and Shivarama Karant in Kannada. So there is very much a tradition of that. So I was really, when I said this, I was really thinking of contemporary fiction, I would say. You know, the fiction that's written since the 90s. And especially if you look at Indian fiction since the 90s, I think it's undeniable that it's increasingly urban. It's increasingly engaged with the same issues that people engage with in the rest of the world, which is identity, that kind of thing. So that's what I meant, really. What are the possibilities in India? I find it very hard to be optimistic. I have friends who are working at the ground, at really the village level, at the ground level. They're trying to create a change at the popular level. But, you know, it's not that people are unaware. Say, this last year was very important in a way because especially there were some important farmers' movements that started, you know, and they, you know, it really changed the nature of the political discourse in India, at least for a while, you know. And they presented long lists of demands to the government. And strangely, climate change doesn't figure on any of that, though they are absolutely all the agrarian crisis in India is very much related to climate change, you know, especially in places like Maharashtra and so on, you know, where again, in a water-stressed area, they were planting very, very thirsty crops like cotton and so on. And now it's increasingly clear that climate change is really going to mess with the monsoons. Not just climate change, it's also this great aerosol cloud that we have over the subcontinent. It's really changing the monsoon patterns. So again, I mean, you know, India is the gift of the monsoon. Basically, life in India is the monsoon. I mean, if the monsoon gets severely impacted, it's already severely impacted. What hope is there? So I do hope that these farmers' movements will actually more actively connect the agrarian distress to climate change. It's really climate change and also pollution.
So to turn things more optimistic, you write these beautiful books, and I feel like half the people who should be reading it don't read in English. So my question is, are any of your books translated into the Indian vernacular languages and Bangla and things like that so that people can read these and understand some of the thoughts that you're putting forth?
Yes, many of my books are translated in Indian languages. Yeah, books, essays, there are many of them. And, you know, Devjani just mentioned the Gyanpith. And the Gyanpith is an extraordinary institution in India. And it reaches really deep into the countryside. And, you know, I see people responding, you know, who you wouldn't normally think of, people who you wouldn't think of being engaged with, as it were, the literary world. But they, you know. The Sahitya Academy, if you win the Sahitya Academy Award, technically your book has to be translated into 19 languages already. So, you know, that way, one of my books won the Sahitya Academy Award. So
That's great, because especially the story you're telling in this book, I feel like it should be read by people in the subcontinent so that it changes the expectations of growth and everything else.
It's going into Hindi and Bangla, so.
It's great, thanks.
49 degrees, that's just springtime in Delhi. So it's a fun place to be in. You should check it out. We can talk about something else if you don't mind. Could you tell me about dancing in Cambodia? The essay sort of left like a deep impact in me. How did you come to write it? And why dancing, say, as opposed to other aspects of Cambodian life during the regime that you chose to pick to write it on?
Thank you. That I wrote that a very long time ago. You know, I went to Cambodia in 93, 92, 93. That was when, I mean, the Khmer Rouge was still active then. And it was a society that was completely destroyed. You know, I mean, it was completely sort of leveled. And it was very interesting to see that in the moment of their utmost despair, what was it that revived them? I wouldn't have thought, I mean, you know, we always think of, when people go through catastrophe, we think of their being revived by money or goods or something like that. But what they turned to was their classical dance. And the great moment of rebirth for them really was this one event when, you know, when they staged classical dance again in Phnom Penh. And the extraordinary story is that this whole Pol Pot thing was so intricately interwoven with dance. I mean, Pol Pot himself grew up in the royal palace. Why? Because his aunt was a famous dancer. And that's why he was educated. That's why he was sent to Paris. And I found this a really extraordinary thing, the whole story of how this came to pass.
All right, so we are mindful of the time now, and so I think please join me in thanking Amitav once more for
Thank you.
speaking.
Thank you.